If I had a nickel for every time a genre-defining director named George made a CGI-heavy prequel to a beloved sci-fi series from the 1970s, which delved further into the internal politics of the world and featured a plot revolving around a trade dispute, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. You know, it's funny, I made this exact joke after seeing Furiosa and The Phantom Menace for its re-release in short sequence of one another a month or so ago, and at the time, I didn't really think much of it. It was just an offhand observation. But as the days went by, the thought lingered in my brain, and the longer it sat there, the more the comparison started to resonate on a deeper level. Beyond the superficial similarities, Furiosa genuinely is George Miller's answer to the Star Wars prequels for one very simple reason. It feels so personal. Regardless of what you think of the prequel trilogy, it's hard to deny they're the culmination of all that George Lucas is as a filmmaker. They typify his ambition to push the technological limits of filmmaking while bringing the thematic elements that underpin the original trilogy to the forefront of the narrative in a way that completely recontextualizes the series. Where the original trilogy of Star Wars films served as a broad metaphor for the struggle against fascism in the midst of the United States' protracted war in Vietnam, the prequels explored that political subtext even more overtly, and with greater specificity, leveling direct criticism against the United States militarism and the corporate and political interests that drive those conflicts and erode democracy. They are George Lucas's magnum opus, not because they're his best films, not by any means, but because they are the purest expression of who Lucas is as an artist. And Furiosa is exactly that for George Miller. Just as George Lucas's work on Star Wars spans his entire career as a filmmaker, the Mad Max films have spanned George Miller's. What started as a rough around the edges indie production shot on rural back roads without permits by a first-time director and his ragtag crew evolved with its creator, becoming more technically and thematically sophisticated with each installment as Miller continued to master his craft. With Furiosa, Miller delivers the apotheosis of that 45-year-long journey, a work that distills all of his preoccupations as a filmmaker into a single elegant package. In a lot of ways, Furiosa feels like the movie George Miller has always been trying to make, the vision he spent his entire career refining his skills in order to realize. And if you want to be like George Miller and tell your own rage-fueled destruction tales of the wasteland, then you've got to check out this video sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is a free-to-play, large-scale multiplayer action game available now on PC, PlayStation, Mac, and Xbox. In War Thunder, you take control of the ground, air, and naval vehicles as you fight through dynamic battles all over the world. When I say vehicles, I'm not just talking about a few. War Thunder's playable crafts span over an entire century. So there's endless ways to win the battle and the war, and while you might not be able to get behind the wheel of the war rig, you can take control of boats, from barges to battleships, even some of the world's most powerful militaries in the history of modern warfare. And the strategic fun doesn't stop with vehicles. In War Thunder, you can use the full might of some of the world's most advanced military technologies, from strike drones to full-on nuclear strikes. It's insane if you want to create your own apocalypse, I guess. And with the constant graphics, physics, and audio updates, War Thunder keeps players fully immersed in the atmosphere of the battle, putting you right in the middle of your own Hollywood blockbuster action movie. The update includes new missiles with active radar honing, 2 new maps, and dozens of updates based on requests from the community. War Thunder's unique damage model says "see you later" to damage bars, with each hit damaging and disabling the enemy in various strategic ways. Take out a tank's tracks and it can't move forward, aim for a fuel tank, and kaboom! And now you too can join the fray by following the link in the description of the video and downloading this amazing game for free. All new players will also receive a ton of bonuses, including rentals for the P-40E-1 aircraft and M4 tank for a week packed with alternate skins for each to switch up your style, a special decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, 3 premium vehicles for free, a week of premium account, and more. So drive, sail, or fly as fast as you can to the link in the description to get started today. I'll see you on the battlefield, and thank you so much to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Let's get one thing out of the way right up front. Prequels tend to be pretty bad, right? Like, or at the very least, underwhelming. For starters, a lot of them tend to be cash grabs, films that are greenlit to capitalize on the success of a film or character. If audiences responded well to something, here's their backstory is a pretty easy sell for studio execs. But the less cynical reason they tend to blow is that they automatically start at a narrative disadvantage. Stories, particularly genre stories, thrive on suspense, but in a prequel, we as the audience know where everything is heading. Even if we don't know how the specific conflict of a story will resolve, we know the end state, because it's where the original story began. The goal becomes finding a way to recontextualize the original story in a manner that complements its original meaning or adds a new wrinkle that can stand on its own. A task that's nigh impossible in the best of circumstances. But what's brilliant about Furiosa is how it manages to be one of the greatest prequels ever made, if not the greatest, by almost completely sidestepping the prequel problem altogether. You see, the Mad Max films have always had a pretty loose relationship with continuity as is, but hey, don't just take my word on that. Take George's.
All the films have no strict chronology. It's probably after Thunderdome, but it's an episode in the life of Max and this world. It's basically an episode, and it's us revisiting that world. Never wrote the story with any of the stories with a chronological connection.
Starting way back with The Road Warrior, which was bookended by narration from the feral kid recounting his experience with Max many years after the fact, the idea has always been that these films are more akin to folklore than your typical blockbuster franchise. The films don't comprise a single definitive timeline of Max's story, but rather form a patch for tales shared about Max within the fictional universe. He's a mythic figure, a folk hero who passes through the wasteland like a post-apocalyptic high plains drifter, and the movies are just one account, one version of his various exploits. But the thing is, this framing device has only ever really existed at the edge of the Mad Max films, based almost entirely on the feral boy's narration in The Road Warrior and the external insight of the creators. In Furiosa, Miller doubles down on this idea and makes it a part of the text for the very first time. Furiosa isn't just a chronicle of its title character's backstory before her appearance in Fury Road. No way, it's a legend about her life, a tale that has been passed through the wasteland before finally reaching us via the History Man, an in-universe historian recounting the myth, and one who, in the final minutes of the film, even admits that the story he's telling is but one of many differing accounts. Furiosa doesn't promise to simply add context to Fury Road, it wants to build an entire world and mythology around it.
The question is, do you have it in you to make it epic?
Miller makes this intention clear immediately in the grammar of the film. Although Furiosa shares the saturated palettes of oranges and teals with Fury Road, it couldn't be any more different in execution. Where Fury Road is a kinetic, punchy tour de force of quick cuts mirroring the blistering momentum of the extended chase that comprises the majority of the film's runtime, Furiosa is slower and more meditative. Shots linger, and the camera moves rather than cutting more often than not. And instead of taking place over a couple of days, Furiosa is a bona fide epic, spanning decades and segmented into chapters, further rooting the film in the sensibilities of folklore and legend. What immediately struck me on my first viewing is how passive Furiosa is as a character throughout much of the film. Don't get it twisted, this is absolutely her story, but like the hero of any myth or legend, that personal story is woven through the broader story of the world around them. Just as Beowulf interweaves factional conflicts in Scandinavia with the details of Beowulf's life, Miller deliberately parallels Furiosa's origin with that of the wasteland itself. From the opening moments of the film, we're thrust back into the downfall of society in a montage reminiscent of the one that opened The Road Warrior. Not only does this refamiliarize us with the history of the world we're about to be dropped into, but it places us back in the early days of the wasteland, a time before the rules of the wasteland as we've come to know them were established. This idea of returning to beginning is further illustrated by the visual language of the first proper scene of the movie. we're introduced to Furiosa as a young girl picking fruits on the edges of a green oasis in the middle of the wasteland. The Edenic scene directly calls to mind the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis, a moment that's punctuated when Furiosa is abruptly cast out against her will, kidnapped by sin, in this case, marauders seeking the abundance of paradise. Not only does this moment communicate to the audience that what we're watching is a kind of fable not dissimilar to a creation myth, but it ties Furiosa's origins to that of the world around her. We're not watching Furiosa become Furiosa, we're watching the wasteland become the wasteland. Furiosa is kind of the perfect character to tell this story because of the fact that she isn't from the wasteland, the way Max is. Max was there for the fall of civilization, he witnessed its rise, and is just as much a part of it as anyone else. But Furiosa isn't. She was raised in a place removed from its ravages and dropped into it as a child, making her the perfect audience surrogate through which we explore the inner workings of the wasteland. She's a fish out of water, so we get to learn as she does. The framing allows for some really phenomenal, organic moments of world building. Through Furiosa's eyes, Miller shows us how the wasteland functions as it transforms into the place we recognize from the later films. Miller expands our understanding of key aspects of the wasteland, such as the infighting between the factions that seek to control the resources, but never over-explains these elements to the point where the world begins to feel small or demystified. We're ultimately locked into Furiosa's perspective, and so we more or less learn what she learns about the world, satiating our desire to learn more just enough while leaving enough ambiguity to continue stimulating our imagination. It's genuinely a fucking masterclass in world building. Like, God, George, make movies like this forever, please. This emphasis on Furiosa's experience adapting to the wasteland zeroes in on one of the core themes of the film. How does one survive in a place like the wasteland?
As the world falls around us, how must we brave its cruelties?
In a way, all of the Mad Max films are about this question on some level, but none so directly. Furiosa is ultimately a story about people's reactions to the wasteland, and at its core is the tension between holding on to hope or giving in to hopelessness. This dichotomy is embodied in the film's two lead characters, Furiosa and Dementis. Both are people who have lost everything to the wasteland. Furiosa lost her home and her mother at the hands of Dementis and his crew when she was dragged from the green place into the wasteland, while Dementis lost his young children at some undisclosed points in the past, likely during the fall of society, somewhat mirroring Max's origin in the original film. But where Furiosa clings to hope that she will be able to find her way home, symbolized by the peach seed she keeps moist for years in the hopes of one day planting it in the green place, Dementis has lost any hope that his life can improve. The cruel, indifferent wasteland has made him bitter and nihilistic, and so he treats those around him with the same malice. Rather than resisting the savagery, he becomes a part of it, physically repulsed by the idea that anyone could possibly hold on to hope in the face of such brutality.
There is no hope! Not for them, not for you, certainly not for me!
When Furiosa is brought to Dementis, he is immediately drawn to her because she embodies everything he has lost. Not only does she remind him of his children, who the wasteland took from him, but also of himself. He sees the parallel between them as an opportunity to feel kinship with another person.
Oh, I've been waiting for you. I've been waiting for someone like you, someone worthy of me. No honor, no rule of law to sort things out. Just two evil bastards out here in the wasteland.
He keeps her imprisoned with him as almost a form of torture designed to slowly erode her hope of ever getting home so that she too will become as broken by the wasteland as he is and won't have to be so alone anymore. Violence and cruelty are the language of the wasteland, and in surrendering himself to it, they become the only way Dementis can express himself, the only things he knows how to feel. He is the savagery of the wasteland incarnate. But the thing about savagery is it's easy to become desensitized to it. If the only thing you ever experience is cruelty, eventually your tolerance for it, your pain threshold, rises to a point where it barely registers for you anymore.
But I don't fear the loss of bliss in heaven or retribution in hell. And I've got a fiendishly high pain threshold.
So what do you do when you become numb to the only thing you're capable of feeling? You do it bigger, more aggressively. In the case of Dementis, we watch him become crueler and crueler as the film goes on, like a junkie chasing the next high, knowing his next hit only pushes the one after it further away. No scene in the film better exemplifies this than the moment Dementis finally catches up with Furiosa and Praetorian Jack, who are fleeing Dementis' botched ambush at the bullet farm in the hopes of escaping their life of service to the overlords of the wasteland and finding a better life in the green place. Dementis is genuinely sickened by their devotion to each other and the spark of hope they each clearly carry. It spits in the face of the nihilism he has surrendered himself to, and so he decides to make an example of them.
See how they fought for each other, this little army of two. Where were they going? So full of hope.
What follows is a fever dream of barbarism as we hold on Dementis' face as the bikes run in rings around him, dragging Jack's body in circles while the hungry dogs give chase, nipping at his feet. Miller cuts frames from the shoot, giving Dementis' uneasy fidgeting and uncanny, inhuman feeling that complements Tom Holkenborg's frantic strings as we crossfade into a wide shot of the horrifying scene consuming Dementis' mind, before cutting back to Dementis hours later in an almost catatonic state, so overwhelmed by the degree of sadism required just to elicit a sliver of human emotion within himself anymore. It is a haunting image that encapsulates how it means to survive in the wasteland without hope. In stark contrast to Dementis' descent into hopelessness is Furiosa, a character defined by her resilience. In spite of every hardship she is forced to endure, Furiosa is bound to the promise her mother swore her to keep.
However long it takes, promise me you'll find your way home.
Her resolve is galvanized by her mother's death, an image seared into young Furiosa's mind by Dementis, who forces her to witness the crucifixion. Furiosa clings to hope through sheer force of will. It is her North Star, figuratively but also quite literally. In this way, Furiosa's journey through the wasteland becomes analogous to another biblical tale, that of Christ in the desert, with Dementis serving as Satan himself, tormenting her spirit and tempting her to relinquish the hope that drives her. At the end of the day, Furiosa understands that violence and cruelty are the language of the wasteland just as well as Dementis does, but she refuses to surrender to it, to become a part of that cycle. Violence is a necessary evil in pursuit of something pure, whether that be her quest to find the green place or her plan to save Immortan Joe's wives in Fury Road. Like Christ, in the story of the Passion, Furiosa becomes a sponge to absorb the sins of the wasteland so that something beautiful and pure can survive and grow untainted by corruption. The only question becomes whether she can stay the course without succumbing to the darkness when faced with the opportunity for revenge. Underpinning the struggle between hope and despair is the concept of justice. What does justice even mean in a place that is fundamentally unjust, and is there anything that separates it from retribution? This dilemma had been a part of the Max films from the beginning, but Furiosa is, once again, more direct in its interrogation. Throughout the film, Furiosa is haunted by what Dementis did to her and her mother, and while she remains resolute in her objective to find her way home, the path to that end is complicated when Dementis barrels his way back into her life. The allure of revenge looms large in her mind. It almost is all-consuming. But once Dementis takes Jack from her and leaves her mortally wounded and rotting in a pit under the Citadel, it threatens to consume her entirely. She renews her uneasy alliance with Immortan Joe, the very thing she and Jack were fleeing, in exchange for the chance to get even with Dementis. And in the final moments of the film, she's faced with a choice: get revenge and become just another instrument of cruelty perpetuating the cycle of violence that fuels the wasteland, or find another way to bring justice. Though the truth of Dementis' face is left ambiguous, in true folklore fashion, the ending we're left with, the one we're to assume is the closest to reality, or at least the reality Furiosa herself chooses to share, illustrates the difference between revenge and justice. While the various other fates we're shown to have possibly befallen Dementis are satisfying and poetic in their own ways, they offer no sense of restoration. They're retributive, suffering as penance. Furiosa may feel a sense of justice within herself, but Dementis' death ultimately serves no one but her. In Dementis' own words,
I'll be dead and you'll still be sorrowing your lovey-dovey and your mummy magnificent. You idiot. You can never balance the scales of their suffering.
it's a momentary relief, and one that will need to be quenched through more and more extreme forms of cruelty as we become dull to it. Were Furiosa to take this path and put Dementis out of his misery then and there, she would simply be dooming herself to the same endless spiral into depravity that has taken hold of Dementis, ever escalating violence without end to keep the pain of loss at bay just a little longer. That isn't justice. Justice restores balance in some way. Furiosa can't make Dementis give back what he's taken from her. That just isn't physically possible, but she can make his punishment restorative in some way. By using him as the soil for the seed of hope she had carried with her for years, she makes her revenge against Dementis so much more than mere retribution. She turns an act of death into an act of life, one that will nourish the innocent wives in the Citadel until a time where Furiosa can be their salvation. Beyond the film's meditation on the toll the wasteland takes on the minds and souls of its inhabitants, Furiosa is also a story about the more logistical aspects of survival in the post-apocalypse, namely, how does a post-civilization human race organize itself? We've obviously gotten many glimpses into the societies and cultures that have formed in the wasteland in the previous Max films, but they generally never concern themselves with the mechanics of these societies. But in Furiosa, George Miller gives us a more detailed look at the politics that drive the wasteland by pitting it against a force that seeks to disrupt the established order: Dementis. As is the case in the previous film, the wasteland is oriented around a single fundamental dynamic: those with an abundance of resources and those without. The people who control the resources run the show, while those without either toil for enough to survive, or they go off on their own and attempt to take it from those who have means. In a very literal sense, it's just an over-the-top metaphor for the capitalist system that governs our world today. And while the system is fundamentally unjust, it functions, which is something Dementis recognizes early on. So rather than contenting himself with playing the role of the bandit or stealing from the powers that be, he formulates a plan to become one himself, to seize control of the resources himself. He rallies people to his cause by calling out the very real injustices of the system and promises to disrupt that system. But in reality, he simply wants to make himself a part of it. Dementis is a fake populist who crudely weaponizes the inequity of the system to secure himself a seat at the table. And once he has that seat, he demonstrates that he completely lacks the ability and the willingness to actually do the job. Because for all his faults, Immortan Joe is an effective administrator. He's cruel and miserly, but he maintains a sense of order that is otherwise unheard of in the wasteland, overseeing a trade agreement with the other fortresses, Gastown and the Bullet Farm. When Dementis takes over Gastown, it's clear he has no idea how to actually run the fortress. His self-serving ends get in the way of maintaining stability, and his people begin to turn on him to reclaim the meager slice of the pie they've lost. And in response to this failure to maintain control, Dementis makes a move to acquire more territory. Like any self-serving politician or CEO, he doesn't actually care about being a leader. He just wants more for the sake of itself. More wealth, more abundance. In disrupting the tenuous order of the wasteland, Dementis unleashes a whole new wave of horror and violence in the form of the 40-Day Wasteland War. But like so many of the pointless conflicts that preceded it, this is a war without purpose. It's just ego-driven. Dementis masquerades as a revolutionary, but this isn't an attempt to upend a broken system. Just like his conquest of Gastown, it's a play to control it. During the preamble to the montage that depicts the 40-day wasteland war, Miller deliberately invokes the conflicts that lead to the destruction of human civilization.
The oil wars, water wars, the tri-nation nuclear war.
In doing so, he tells us that this senseless conflict reflects the same pointless greed and apathy that led humanity to ruin. Although the film doesn't directly depict the collapse, we're invited to read this war as a proxy for it. Coupled with the montage that opens the movie, it becomes the closest thing we'll ever get to a definitive origin story for the wasteland. Our self-destruction as the result of leaders with no sense of vision outside the accumulation of more power and wealth, a prospect that feels closer and closer to every single day. It really stands to repeat just what a triumph Furiosa is. George Miller is almost 80 years old and is running circles around filmmakers half his age, producing a work with more energy and dynamism than most Hollywood blockbusters could only dream of having, and taking bold swings as big ideas that resonate long after the credits have rolled. I can't overstate how easy it would have been to simply ape the success of Fury Road. Hell, most people thought Furiosa was just going to be another Fury Road, and I'm sure the studio just wanted George Miller to make a movie that is essentially more of the same. But that's never, ever been who George Miller is. And just another Fury Road is not what we get with Furiosa. I'm sure for some, that's disappointing, but I can't help but respect the hell out of Miller for refusing to rest on his laurels at a point in his career where most people would be willing to excuse it, and instead daring to continue evolving. It's a gambit that I think pays off in spades. Furiosa is fresh and exciting, reflecting on ideas Miller has explored his entire career in new ways while continuing to refine his mastery of his technical craft. There's an old school sensibility to the filmmaking that is imbued with an energy that is unmistakably modern. Sequences like the 20-minute long prologue or the exceptional war rig assault have such a sense of patience as the sequences gradually build momentum, compounding tension without you even realizing it until it reaches terminal velocity and cannot be stopped. Like, fuck, dude, just look at this stuff. I genuinely had white knuckles by the end of the war rig battle without even registering that my hands had been gripping the seat. Like, fuck, man, that is power. That is art. That is the filmmaker doing the shit that they do best. Like, Miller has such a grasp on the language of cinema that he manages to do this several times throughout Furiosa. This may not be as relentless a film as Fury Road, but what it lacks in nonstop action, it more than makes up for in suspense. This is a bleak, moody film that knocked me on my ass, and I had to just sit there and just process what the hell I just watched because it was so powerful, it was so heavy, it was so truthful. And yet, because it has such an earnest heart, I could probably watch it over and over again without ever losing interest or feeling beaten down. Some of the visual effects are, maybe not the greatest when compared to the seamless wizardry of Fury Road, but it ultimately adds to the intentional artifice of the story. We're listening to a legend, a folktale, your grandfather sitting down to tell you about the ways of the world and the things that matter to him. And the heightened nature of the visual style only reinforces that device. It's a genuine shame Furiosa's box office performance wasn't what Warner Brothers or George Miller or people like you and I would have hoped it would be, because it is without a doubt one of the best films I've seen all year. And not just that, but genuinely one of the greatest prequels of all time. George Miller has woven a modern-day epic and turned Furiosa into a folk hero to rival the legend that put him on the map as a filmmaker in the first place.